Bon après-midi, good afternoon, good morning to all of you from across the country. Welcome to the CSPC Annual Budget Symposium titled Decoding Federal Budget 2023 for Science and Innovation. This presentation coming to you, the analysis of the budget and the reactions from different sectors to the budget, as we always do in the past number of years at CSPC, in the last 3 years at least, in a virtual format. Welcome you all to this session. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge the land I'm talking to you from, Richmond Hill, Ontario, the traditional land and unceded territory of Wenda, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence continues to this day for thousands of years. And today, Richmond Hill is home to many diverse First Nations. Today's symposium is in 3 parts. First, a budget analysis starting in a minute for 1 hour, and followed by a panel of academics at 2 p.m. For 1 hour. And then we will have a pause, a break at 2 p.m. for 15 minutes. And then we'll restart at 2:15 with the panel of business and private sector. You don't need to leave the Zoom room or change the links or anything like that. If you leave the Zoom link or Zoom room, you can come back with the same link that you registered for. So before anything, I want to make sure that we use the time properly, because we have very limited time, a lot of materials to be covered. And go right to the presentation by 2 fantastic speakers. As always, we have Dave Waters with us. Dave Waters is no stranger to this audience. He's the president of Global Advantage Consulting Group. He founded, and he has the 30 years plus experience in public service in various positions in different federal departments, and for many years, assistant deputy ministers at different departments, including Finance Canada, Treasury Board, and Industry Canada. And the Global Advantage is doing the mapping complex of public policy economic systems and for creating collaborative business models for service delivery. Dave has served on our board for a number of years, and now he's a strategic advisor of CSPC. And welcome, Dave, to this session. As well, I want to welcome Michael Rowell, who is the Director of Data Analytics and Business Development at Global Advantage Consulting Group. Michael is also presenting some of the data to us. He's specialized in developing and implementing data analytics strategic and conducting market research. He is a graduate of London School of Economics with Master of Science in Global Politics. Without any further ado, the virtual stage is yours, Dave and Michael, and thank you for being with us.
Meredith, thank you very much for that terrific introduction. Just a couple of personal notes. Life can really throw curveballs at you. About 10 minutes ago, the internet, I'm calling from Playa del Carmen, Mexico, and the internet went completely out. So we've actually, in the last 10 minutes, vacated our condo. We've gone down into another building of another unit completely, and they were fortunate enough to give us a room and to be able to get us connection as well. So I apologize for some of the quick changes that we've had to undergo. Second thing I want to really kind of emphasize just a little bit is that the presentation we're going to give are really based upon the observations of our staff, who are working intently with a variety of clients, public sector, private sector, academic sector, over a long period of time. We don't advocate that we really understand and have a terrific idea of the truth here. We have observations, though, based on our experience, and we want to raise some of those insights with you about Budget 2023, with the objective of trying to encourage a really good discussion of a number of these issues. I think the time is right for that deeper discussion to take place. We've called this the Bupkis Budget, Decoding Budget 2023 for Science and Innovation. Paul Davidson, the head of Universities Canada, in relation to one of his members, this was a statement that they had made about the impact of the budget on the academic community, calling it the Bupkis budget. This is a Yiddish word. It means absolutely nothing. And we'll get into that because there are some elements that are quite fairly significant in terms of the higher education sector, particularly for colleges. But I thought that that title was actually quite relevant and quite important. Now, next slide. The agenda that Michael and I are going to follow then really has three components. Number one, we'll look at the global R&D context. Two, we'll look at the Canadian RDI performance. Then we'll have a look at budget 2023 and its impact on that, that system, on the performance of the RDI system. Has it helped? Has it hindered? Is it Bupkis? And if so, where? And then finally, four, we'll look at a pathway to improving our performance over the next 5 years to December 2028. Next please, Michael. I want to begin with the very significant challenges that frame how a budget is prepared and has quite an impact on it. Widespread, so here are the 10 key ones that we had noticed. That widespread inflation, I mean, people really have been struggling in terms of food and energy costs, and you know, businesses in terms of the impact on supply chains and semiconductor chips and so on. And number two, the increased geopolitical conflict. Obviously, the Ukraine. I mean, this may be the beginning of an era of a much more competitive kind of environment when you also include Taiwan and what the Chinese are doing actually right now in terms of naval exercises with carrier fleets off the coast of Taiwan. So a very unsettled geopolitical environment that actually then has an impact on budgetary expenditures. We've put quite correctly, I think, a lot of support in for Ukraine. Erosion of social cohesion, number three. Really important to begin to understand and unpack this. And you know, there are others that are more adept at doing that, but really a significant erosion of trust, particularly of governments. And if you follow the Edelman annual kind of report, it really is quite devastating in terms of how quickly that trust has eroded for major institutions. The deepening China-US tech war. There are a series of reports that Eric Schmidt has developed, so the ex-head of Google, looking at this issue and you know, I think really getting on board many of the US lawmakers about the nature of the Chinese advances with respect to technology and how the US is falling further and further behind. And plans then to try and rectify that, and that leads directly into number five, the US Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act. I mean, just stunning amounts of money being put in, mostly through the tax system, which can have an immediate impact in terms of incentives to encourage a much greater and faster evolution of clean technologies in the US, and then also looking at the growth of a semiconductor chip industry. All of these, of course, with the Biden-Trudeau visit, have an impact on Canada. Number six, the elephant in the room. So the accelerating global energy transition. I can't emphasize enough how huge this is, and I actually still think it's being underestimated in terms of the magnitude. We're going to have to change every aspect of the way in which we produce, transport, consume all of the products that we find important for our particular lifestyle in Canada. This budget, of course, does concentrate on the electrical system, and we'll get into that in more detail. Number seven, this persistent banking financial uncertainty with the decline of the Silicon Valley Bank, and then several others in the US and then also in Europe. And there is this fragility right now that many experts are talking about in terms of the system and whether it produces a recession. And that, of course, has impact in terms of government revenues and therefore what the government can afford to do in the future. Number eight, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with ChatGPT. We've been training our staff on this. We've been using it extensively. It's astounding, I find. It does make mistakes, no question about it, but the impact it's going to have because it commoditizes knowledge. So it becomes less important what you know. You got a whole system that knows far more than you do. The issue is it places a premium on, well, what can you do? What are your skill sets? How can you demonstrate that? So I believe this is going to be transformative for everyone actually listening to this particular presentation. Number 9, the increased extreme weather events. We've been focusing on number 6, GHG reduction. I think in this budget, actually, there's only like 4% of all of the sort of environmental expenditures that are really zeroing in on adaptation. I think we've underestimated grossly the impact this is going to have, and this is politically sensitive. This is local in terms of its impact: floods, fires, storms, drought, and increasingly. I mean, I was just noticing, even though we're calling from Playa del Carmen, Mexico, I think about a week ago, there was a bit of an ice storm again in Ottawa. I mean, you've got these very unusual weather patterns that are beginning to wreak havoc on many local communities. And then declining economic growth. Quite correctly, Minister Freeman calls this the Achilles heel of the Canadian economy, this low productivity. But the impact really of this lower growth means lower government revenues and lower ability then to be able to meet some of the concerns of various groups across the country. The overall conclusion, though, when you look at these 10, is that government can't solve these things. Michael Savia, a few years ago, actually talked about this, and to his credit, he's actually, left the private sector to become our Deputy Minister of Finance. That government, it's not capable of solving all of the issues that it has in front of us, and this then raises the issue. Look, we got to figure out how we can work together, new structures. I think new leadership, younger leadership, in my view. To be able to work together in a much more effective way. And that means real power sharing by government. Next slide. Building on that overall conclusion, there's a statement recently that I found really insightful from Henry Mitzberg of McGill University, quite a well-known figure in terms of the business community, in terms of understanding some of the challenges. But he really here talked about the limits to growth driven by the pursuit of individual rights at the expense of shared responsibility. And that perhaps we don't have the balance right, that we really need to look at collectively what we want to achieve and how we can do it. And he calls this a declaration of independence. That core idea, I think, is essential in terms of finding solutions to the research, development, innovation challenges that we face in Canada. We're going to be developing that theme further. Next, please. This leads then to what I call the great fragmentation. This is the Humpty Dumpty rhyme we probably all learned as kids. But we fragmented all of the programs in the areas of research and innovation that we're concerned about. On the innovation growth kind of side, I've just listed many of the key science-based departments and agencies. Then we're going to be creating 2 new crown corporations, the Canada Innovation Corporation, the Growth Fund, and so on and so forth. We're fragmenting even more what really should be unified in meeting some of the challenges that different parts of our society are facing. In the research side, we've done the same. NSERC, SHRC, CIHR, CFI, the National Research Council now. Actually, we segmented it just recently, made it fragmented. We're going to take out IRAP and put it over on the left-hand side, and the research institutes of the NRC remain on the right. And then you've got the Bouchard report asking for a new structure, the CKSF, and then also a new advisory board. So fragmenting even further the overall approach that we have. So that fragmentation, while we're focused about it on the research development innovation system and the challenges it faces, is actually much broader. There's a fragmentation in terms of how you assist supply chains that are going to give us adequate housing or cleaner energy or better healthcare. And we segment. We don't look at all of these things, how they form a single path to achieve a result, which is helping Canadian citizens. And then arguably on even a larger scale, when you put this all together, one really can say that we're fragmenting society. And who's going to put it together again? Obviously, these are bigger issues, but they give you context for looking at research, development, and innovation. Next, please. So let's quickly look at our overall innovation performance. It's poor. People, I think, know that. All of the assessments, grade D-, and it's been declining over a long period of time. Next. This really shows the how small Canada is with respect to the RDI kind of context. I think it ends up being about 1.3% of global investments in R&D. So the size of the bubble shows you the size of the investments in total that we're making. When you look at the left-hand scale, so the height of the bubble from the baseline, that reflects the number of researchers. So we're fine. We've got lots of researchers in Canada. But when you then look at performance, and the further you are to the right, the better you're performing. There you have Israel, you have South Korea, you've got Japan, Germany, obviously the United States, and so on. And Canada really is, it's decreasing and it's becoming a laggard. So it really is not contributing and not really, I don't think, understanding the importance of research development and innovation to helping grow the Canadian economy to produce the revenue that we need for the variety of social programs. Next, please. Here we have the weak attempts that we've had over basically a 20-year period, beginning with Alan Rock and Jane Stewart, going to Joe Rotman, Maxine Bernier and Flaherty, Tom Jenkins' report, Ed Holder, Baines Barton, and now we have the kind of Phelan Sabia approach. But again, the gap, and this reflects the current data just out from the OECD, a $25 billion gap per year in terms of what we would need to invest to actually just become average. That's all. I mean, we're just totally headed in the wrong direction, and we don't seem to understand the magnitude of the difference between the approach we have taken and the approach the average OECD country has taken, much less the star kind of performance. Next page. Yeah, this is reflected it shows the 100-meter sprint, and you can see the Canadian on the top left-hand corner running the wrong way. Everybody else has been accelerating over the past 10-year period. Canada has been actually declining. I mean, it really is quite marked. One of the issues you can raise is, gee, maybe we better talk to the coach of the Canadian team. I mean, who's managing this process? Maybe we should be telling the guy he should be running the other way. So this is just meant to highlight the quite remarkably poor Canadian performance over a broad period of time. Next, please. Yeah, one of the things that I really kind of praise is John Nubley has been doing a lot of work on this. And by the way, he did a recent report in the last week with Stuart Beck, which is excellent. I highly recommend that everybody read that. But John Nubley, to his credit, identified here last year that, yeah, look, we goofed. We made certain assumptions about how the system would work, and clearly they're not working. And then talks about the fact that we really need to rethink our approach in total. And I think he's right on. Next slide, please. The Bouchard report. This came out just recently. Wow, what a report. One of the things in terms of this theme about we've got to rethink the entire system. They had many, many good conclusions, I think, and one of them actually being to increase the amount of support we provide for research. But one of the strongest and most consistent messages they heard was the need for a national strategy for science, research, and innovation to drive the whole system towards objectives. We don't have it. He talks then about the fact that we have this ad hoc approach, that there's no process to link these things together, that we don't know what the government priorities and programs are. And this lack of a strategy, which is actually quite unique among OECD countries, is something that I think we really need to address, because it'll permit others to align themselves to those objectives and to those targets. Next, please. Yeah, I think everybody is quite familiar with the kind of rankings that we have. We rank 19th in terms of the GERD to GDP in terms of the OECD. Total business ratio is actually even worse. Talent, we've got great talent in the country, and most of the studies actually show that. The bottom three are really from the same WIPO Global Innovation Index. And what's disturbing is that while we do have great inputs, again, looking at the talent and infrastructure and so on, our outputs are terrible. And then when you look at the ratio How are we doing relative to other countries in terms of how they use their inputs to achieve an output? I mean, it looks like we're 129th. I mean, it really is a remarkably poor performance. Next, please. Well, how does this all fit in terms of the research and development landscape in terms of expenditures? And you've seen this schema before. It's been updated. You've got the 6 sources of R&D funding at the top. But what's noteworthy is that in terms of, well, who actually performs R&D? And you see higher education sector and you see the business sector. In terms of performing R&D, provinces really don't do very, very much. And the federal government doesn't do very much as well with the science-based departments and agencies. Arguably, that should be looked at pretty carefully in terms of all of the regulatory and policy issues that the federal government faces. And are we putting enough money into understanding all of the issues in terms of generative AI, in terms of AI in general, privacy concerns, data concerns, who owns information, how is it transported, where is it stored? I mean, all of these issues get quickly into issues of regulation and standards and policymaking. And arguably, government needs to have a robust capability, because this is not the job of the private sector, to actually do the research on those issues that have a public interest. With respect to the higher education and the business sector, I mean, this is where Canada is an outlier in terms of how we have chosen to manage our R&D kind of effort. Next page, please. Yeah, here is looking at Canada in red, how we allocate our R&D activity. In terms of the private sector, we're well below. We do about 51% of our research there. This compares to much higher levels in other countries, far higher, in fact, even including in the United States, where they do 74% of their research in the private sector. You see that small component in the public sector where we don't follow the pattern in terms of the OECD and ensuring that the public sector in terms of research and development for regulatory and standards and policy making is adequately supported. And we have a model where we do a huge amount of research actually in the university community. Doesn't happen in the US. It's only 12% in the US in terms of the allocation of their sources, whereas in Canada it's 41%. One has to raise the question, have we got the structure right? Does it make sense? What are the advantages and disadvantages of this approach? And if our performance overall continues to decline, are there any clues here as to the adjustments that we may want to make? And it may well be that the Department of Finance and others are asking those very questions. Next slide, please. Yeah, over to you, Michael.
Yeah, this is where I take over. Thanks, Dave. I'm just building a little anecdote for Dave talking about financial security. TD Bank is now the world's most shorted bank in the global financial system. So just speaking to the uncertainty that's facing Canadians and the pervasiveness of the issues and how global they are in context. But now, out of all that context, we kind of jump into budget 2023. And then what we tried to do is in line with the recent budget since 2015 is show the kind of net fiscal impact, at least along the first 2 years. So 2023 to 2025. And budget 2023 has a $13.3 billion net fiscal impact. It's actually the smallest Trudeau budget in the last 5 years, though admittedly, we do have to omit the COVID-19 response, which was kind of an outlier in this. But in terms of stimulus spending, the net fiscal impact of budget 2023 over a 5-year period is expected to be $45.8 billion. And if we look at Trudeau budget number 4, number 6, number 7, and number 8, where it accounts for about just over $120 billion in stimulus spending over just those 4 budgetary periods. And so the question comes in, does this stimulus spending and does budget 2023 actually effectively anticipate and deal with the myriad of problems and the growing list of issues that Canada faces both domestically and internationally? And that's kind of where we will jump into it and look at how the budget is structured and its components and how it impacts specifically higher education, the private sector and the government sector, and then what its implications are for foreign markets and Canada's trade picture. But in essence, budget 2023 kind of has 3 major pillars, and it looks at health, specifically within health, dental care, clean energy, talking about the green electricity and the green energy, and then all those also affordable life. Affordable life is a little bit smaller of a component compared to the first two, but what is largely absent from the budget is there's no innovation, no real commitment towards national security and defense, and outside clean energy, almost no economic growth. And this is a little bit problematic because while the budget introduces several pro-growth initiatives, to what Dave was saying, it lacks a coherent plan for actually driving long-term sustainable economic growth. And in the face of growing economic challenges and competition with global counterparts, Canada kind of requires more of a clear framework that actually will enhance productivity, which is lacking in face of our competitors, and attract increased business investments and make our industries a little bit more innovative. And so when we're going through, we're looking at kind of the budget. It's pillar one, that health and dental care aspect, net fiscal impact of 31.3 billion, just over 31.3 billion over the next 5 years. And the largest measures is a new health transfer of 22.2 billion, 13 billion committed to implement the Canadian dental care plan. Dave will speak to this a little bit more, but the total allocation towards this now exceeds original expectations and forecasts, and it's now estimated to be around 35 billion over the 10 years to 2033, 500 million to help develop new health data indicators. And then kind of what happens here as well as in terms of 359 million to support Canadian drugs and substances strategy, which is a great value add here. And then also 250 million to establish an oral health access fund. And then we move on to the kind of the second pillar of the budget. And this is kind of one of the biggest ticketed items is kind of looking at clean energy. There's 21 environmental measures out of the 165 budget lines in budget 2023 that are committed towards clean energy and climate change and the environment, restoration, what have you. And it allocates 21 billion over between 2023 and 2028, especially when we're looking at the clean energy side, clean electricity, clean hydrogen, clean manufacturing, a little bit of multi-sectoral, looking at CCUS production. It's the tax credits are the biggest ticketed item on the budget. We have a 15% refundable tax credit for non-emitting electricity generation systems, abated natural gas-fired electricity generation, stationary electricity storage systems, and a few other things. I will come at an initial cost of 6.3 billion, but the budget also includes a note that with an additional $19.4 billion cost through 2035. There's another refundable tax credit, 30% tax credit on investments in new machinery and equipment used to manufacture clean technologies. Again, comes at a $4.5 billion ticket over the next 5 years, but an additional 6.6 through 2035. Similarly, an investment for clean hydrogen with an initial an investment tax credit for clean hydrogen with an initial budget cost of 5.6 billion and then additional 12.1. So once you actually start adding up all of the additional costs, the budget allocates the net fiscal impact of these measures along clean energy is actually around 70 billion through 2035. And this is kind of broken down. It's really focused on investment tax credits in order to spur business investment. And it's outside of just the investment tax credits. Budget 2023 also announces that the Canada Growth Fund, the $15 billion capitalized fund, will be managed by the Public Sector Pension Investment Board. And then in response to the Inflation Reduction Act, another notable measure is that the federal government will work with Canada's biofuel sector over the coming period to look into growth opportunities and best position the industry in response to the IRA and how it subsidizes the production and the investment of certain clean fuels, notably sustainable aviation fuels, and how that will negatively impact the Canadian industry here down up north. And then kind of looking into the overall clean energy, we come up with, the government is focusing on one component of the value chain of the decarbonization of Canada's industry. $70 billion is a subset of the whole effort to get to net zero and reduce greenhouse gases. And what is slightly lacking is a coherent strategy to actually achieve these outside of just the electrification, green electrification. Notably, it's looking at in terms of how has the government positioned, what talent, training, and skills are needed, what money and investors are needed, what new knowledge needs to be created, what new resources need to be inputted. And it's not just for one or two of these, it's for each step along the value chain. All of these considerations have to be at play. And what's lacking is that kind of coherent strategy in order to reach net zero. And while it's great that the government is focusing primarily on clean energy and clean electrification on this one, what we notice is that when we're looking at Canada's commitments towards net zero, which is reaching, and even our commitments for 2030, which is reaching 443 megatons by 2030, is that electricity counts our electricity emissions reductions over the next 7 years represents just 47 megatons of the 209 that we have to reduce our emissions by. So it's looking at how can we actually do that in the long term, and what especially can we do in the oil and gas sector, the building sector, and the other sectors where we have to reduce far greater amount of emissions. And this comes out to, while we're reducing emissions in budget 2023, also the lack thereof is how do we actually properly adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. And to Dave's point, only 4% of budget 2023 was actually allocated towards adaptation, while the rest is towards mitigation. And it's great to continue to hold the belief that we will reach our net zero targets, but the World Economic Forum just recently in their 2023 Global Risk Report noted that out of the top 10 most severe risks facing humanity in the next 10 years are environmental and climate change related. And in the next 2 years, in the next 10 years, the top 4 are all environmental related. In the next 2 years, 5 out of the top 10 all environmental related. Specifically, mitigation is the second in the next 10 years. The lack of preparedness for adapting to climate change is the second most severe risk facing humanity. And so it's looking at how, at the same time, we're trying to mitigate and reach our net zero targets, how do we adapt to and respond to the increasing effects of climate change. And then the pillar 3, affordable life. This one is kind of a little bit smaller of a ticket item, and it's in response largely to the cost of living crisis that is currently going on in Canada. And this has 2 major ticketed items. It's a $1.9 billion investment to implement a co-developed urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy, and $2.5 billion grocery rebate. And although those are great, a recent Ipsos poll that just came out last week found that 63% of Canadians who actually own a home, who don't own a home, feel that owning a home is completely out of reach and have given up. And only 27% of people surveyed believe the government is actually doing enough on housing affordability. And so it's looking at, well, these measures are welcomed. What will their long-term impact be, considering that Canada ranks at the lower ends of the OECD in terms of actual inhabitants' dwellings per 1,000 residents. And it's been this way for over a decade now, too. There hasn't been an upward trend in the Canadian housing market. And inside the budget itself, there's kind of these 10 programs, and these are the 10 largest programs, and they have a net fiscal impact of about $61 billion over the next 5 years. 5 of the largest programs are orientated towards health and social services, 4 of which are more economically orientated, and then just one, the kind of increasing NATO's common budget, is positioned towards responding to the increasing national and international threats, and is more positioned towards defense and security. And then kind of we switch over to the health side, and this is, I'm going to switch back to Dave there real quick so he can respond to one of the biggest ticket items in the budget.
Right, thanks very much. I thought we'd have a little fun here, but with an element of a serious overtone. Nothing wrong with extending healthcare to 9 million Canadians, but the issue is, can we afford it, and can we afford it at this time? Because this is the largest program. If you're wondering why investments were dropped on a research, innovation, trade, economic growth side, it's because this government needed to stay in power, and the only way it could do so was to strike a deal with the NDP for this very expansive dental care plan. So and one of the first things for me is when I look at the Canadian Constitution, I do not find this as a requirement of the federal government. I mean, this is a matter of health. This is a provincial jurisdiction, and yet we are funding this at a significant cost over a long period of time. And what's a dental plan without the tooth fairy? So we have our little picture on the left-hand side. Next, please. So here you have from the movie Django, a couple of dentists arriving in town. You see the tooth on the top of the carriage bouncing around as they enter the town. The story behind this is, where are we going to get all the dentists from? And Michael and I think we found a way. Here are a couple of dentists, and maybe we can import them into Canada to begin to get out into remote communities and achieve our net zero cavities objective by 2023. The issue is, what kind of planning have we done? I mean, the number of dentists we're going to need, how this is going to be rolled out, and the terrific cost associated with this plan. raises the issue, what is it squeezing out? There are always opportunity costs, and is this the right investment for Canada at this particular time? Next slide, please. Here we have challenges from national leaders, including John F. Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon in this decade. So Winston Churchill, talking about the World War II, we shall never surrender. Martin Luther King, I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And then we have our Prime Minister. Budget 2023 will help millions of Canadians see a dentist. Is this really going to inspire Canadians? I mean, this is $35 billion. I mean, part of budget should be to give a direction, a moral kind of anchor in terms of where we're going as a country and inspire Canadians. Now, maybe Canadians will choose to become dentists. I don't know. But to me, it just raises some significant questions we need to think about as we continue to have budgets adopt fiscal measures, which are really not a federal responsibility. They're a provincial responsibility. Next, please. We're also creating a culture of narcissism. So we're looking at the $35 billion for terrific teeth and smiles and so on. At the same time, as Michael showed in the budget, for all of our Canada leadership in the world initiative, foreign policy, defense policy, national security policy, trade policy, we invested $0.8 billion compared to this $35 billion. I mean, to me, this is a fundamental issue that Canadians should have had the ability to discuss. But again, don't worry when we go to our international conferences and negotiate, we're going to be able to say, hey, check out these teeth. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you now. The thing that just to encourage you, I want to have 10 minutes at the end in terms of the wrap up. So I think you're really just going to have to hit the editorial, the single editorial comment in relation to most of the subsequent slides then. Thanks, Michael.
Perfect. And just speaking to the social orientation of the budget, it's just the breakdown in terms of net fiscal impact and how measures are allocated is 63% are socially orientated and only 37% are economically. So building on what Dave was saying, also notably what you'll find in the annexes of the budget is the deficits in debt servicing that we're incurring through these budgets, and projected over the next 5 years that our budget deficits through 2028 will be about 175 billion, and our projected debt servicing charges will be 270 billion, peaking at 50.3 billion in 2028, representing just about 9.3% of our federal revenues, which just speaks to the flexibility to actually respond to exogenous shocks and the flexibility of the government to administer programs. And then over the next sections, I'll briefly go over kind of what the impact of the budget was on the various stakeholders in Canada's R&D ecosystem, specifically government, which, as we know, Canada's GVRD, government expenditures on research and development, have been decreasing since 2000 and now represent about half of the OECD average in terms of percent of GDP, ranking Canada 24th. The major science-based departments and agencies kind of spread out collectively spend $5.97 billion on extramural R&D and about $2.65 on intramural R&D. Specifically, the majority is spent, in terms of intensity with the NRC, but now with the introduction of the CIC, is that the outlook of Canada's science-based departments and agencies will change a little bit. CIC will subsume IRAP and represent a $650 million annual commitment, where now NRC will lose the majority of its extramural R&D funding and kind of still represent the hub for government R&D activity. And then looking at how and what the government actually invests in intramural and extramural S&T, which incorporates R&D and related scientific activities, is kind of its focus primarily on health. Second is industrial production and technology, and then followed by agriculture, environment, education, and looking at kind of where the government prioritizes. And what Budget 2023 doesn't have is that the major federal programs supporting our research, development, and innovation in Canada actually didn't receive a budgetary top-up. Weren't really a primary focal point. SIF was the only one that was allocated $50 million in new spending for 2023-2024, and to repurpose money towards clean technologies. And then looking at kind of what were the budgetary measures for the federal science ecosystem, I would just want to draw $59 million to manage key federal science and technology infrastructure. There's over 199 federal science research centers across the country. And then $1.2 billion for the Canadian Space Station to actually develop and contribute to lunar utility vehicles to put astronauts on the moon. Is kind of the focal points we wanted to mention. Higher education, as to what Dave said, bupkis. So higher education is kind of the saving grace in terms of our our herd, higher education expenditure on R&D. We do rank 6th in the OECD, but the trend line is a steep downward decline from 2020 to the preliminary results for 2022. And just looking at how, despite representing kind of 2.3% in economic terms of the Canadian economy, it produces 100% of Canada's innovative talent. It's right now there's 2.2 million enrollments across post-secondary institutions, 1.4 million in universities, 800,000 in colleges, and it does a great job at attracting international talent. And also, but there's kind of in the Canadian system, as we've seen, there's this bifurcation of roles for higher education, where it also performs a large component of the country's research and development efforts. And this is kind of looking at the split of actual personnel, and there's only 29% of the R&D personnel actually are employed by the higher education ecosystem in Canada, whereas the vast majority, 65%, are employed by the private sector. And this is despite the representation and the reality that there's a skills mismatch between how especially PhDs and postgrads are being trained for academic careers, but in reality, the majority of them end up in the private sector. So it's just speaking to this kind of duality in the higher education in terms of talent development, but also research and development that kind of has to be addressed in the Canadian system. And these are the major budgetary measures. Specifically, the biggest one is actually just 108 million to expand the college and community innovation program. The top two are actually for student assistance, and the bottom one is to continue post-traumatic stress research through the Canadian Institute for Public Safety and Research. And then obviously these reactions the budget has gotten different reactions out of different people. Paul Davidson, president of University Canada, said that universities are disappointed with budget 2023, whereas Denise Amiot, president and CEOs of Colleges and Institute Canada, said it's showing that the government of Canada recognizes the growing importance of applied research in colleges and institutes, and it's kind of that connection with the private sector and more focused on the commercial end of R&D rather than on kind of the basic end. So it's looking at different reactions, and then also Alex Usher just responding to that this is the worst budget for higher education since the mid-90s, when we were also facing a debt crisis. And looking at the sector itself, higher education has to rethink the way it lobbies government and the way it shows its value, and maybe not so heavily focused on publications and rather looking at, well, how does it also support the continuum of innovation? And then on the business sector is looking at this is
Michael, can I just check for a moment? And I want to check with Meredith. I'm going to need about 8 minutes to do our wrap-up section. We've got the business section and the trade section, and I want to ask Meredith, how much time would Michael have for those sections?
Dave, we have 15 minutes. We can extend it to 20 minutes in total for the entire presentation. That includes the Q&A, because we want to make sure that we have some questions and videos. So I would suggest that together you can use perhaps another 5 to 8 minutes in total to wrap it up.
Okay, I think then Michael, do well. Let me suggest then that I might just very quickly proceed. That we may need a little bit more than 5 to 8 minutes. The issue here, and Michael, you can join as I kind of go through this, is really just pointing out the major problem in terms of a gap between how much research and development the private sector is doing and the average in the OECD. And this leads into our issue that to be able to get the revenues for the business sector to support this, they're going to have to require a lot of assistance in terms of export promotion. That's the basic kind of issue. The next slide, I don't think we'll need to discuss. People are generally familiar with it. This is a terrific summary in terms of the Hamilton Index, looking at the sorry state of Canada's innovation industries, where we're really bottom of the pack, even lower than Mexico in terms of that kind of capability. Our exports tend to be mostly natural resources, minerals and things like that and so on. But in terms of these higher technology components, we really are not performing well. The Authors of that report actually came to Canada, briefed a number of departments and agencies in the National Research Council, and I think it's made quite an impact. Next slide. This is meant to show the value capture chain in terms of critical minerals and all of the steps in terms of developing those minerals, developing batteries in green, developing the electricity grid system in orange or yellow, and then developing the electric vehicles, all of the components. The issue is this is all a value capture chain. When you're looking at innovation, it isn't just innovation in any one component. It's innovation in the whole chain to be effective. And one of the key objectives actually to reduce greenhouse gases at the end of all of these investments. Obviously, it should also be noted that to produce the mines, the battery plants, do the processing requires even more energy. So you're looking at this on a net basis over a long period of time. The next slide. This next one is just really, showing Canada versus vis-a-vis the OECD that we're not investing enough in national defense, and it is a huge problem. If we're going to form serious partnerships with the US on any economic activity, defense has to be a key component of this, and we're not there yet. The next slide really is just looking at the structure of the major organizations, including the new ones like the Canada Growth Fund at top, and the Canada Innovation Corporation in the middle level there, and then the NRC is changing. Those are the three organizations that are changing the most in terms of the mix that we've got. Next slide. This looks at the major investments. I think that Michael's done an excellent job in terms of talking about those in terms of the tax credits. One of the key bases of using the tax credit is you can say as of July 1st, here's the change, and a business can react. You don't have to build up a program as you do with so many other activities. That's why I think the United States is smart in terms of using the tax system now in terms of getting to clean technology, and we should be following suit. This is a Canadian problem, the Trojan horse problem. When you look at the ownership of Canadian industry, it really is getting skewed in many areas and has been like that. Manufacturing, 44% is actually foreign-owned and controlled, oil and gas extraction, mining, and so on. So there's some challenges there that we need to think about and address in a key way. Next slide, actually just go on to we'll make these available. Next slide then in terms of trade. Next, the almost no measures really to support increased trade in this particular budget. And I think that is kind of a huge oversight. Next slide. You're looking at the Canadian market, 38 billion. We have to trade. We have to trade with China, India, the EU, USA, Mexico, and so on and so forth. And I just don't think we're doing enough to try and support those activities. On the other hand, we're all going to have great teeth. Next slide. This really looks at the who we're trading with, and this is why the Biden-Trudeau summit I think was extraordinarily important. The U.S. was saying we want to trade with you. There are areas where we want to join in partnership with you, and we need to exploit those more fully. Next slide. This really picks up the fact that there's such a sensitivity in terms of carbon-based products, energy products, motor vehicles, all of those that are identified in red. So what are we going to replace those components with, as increasingly they will decline over time? A real problem. Next slide. Yeah, we really talked about that. These partnerships that the U.S. is trying to offer us, we need to really look at seriously and what are the full kind of implications of those. Next slide. Yeah, so what's the pathway? The issue here is really looking at the performance problem. We don't have an RDI goal. Almost every other country does. Finland really, has set a new one in terms of going over 4% in terms of its GDP. The EU coalescing around 3%, China 3%. We're currently at that, about 1.6%, and we have no objective. Low investment in terms of the research and development by a huge amount. This is 25 million per year. No competitive industrial strategies. The number of outstanding, experts in this area. Robert Aslan has written about this, the work that Travis Sutton has talked about it with James Meadowcraft, the Nubley is talking about it, and so on and so forth. We need to really rethink this approach we have to industrial strategy. No alignment in terms of spending, tax, regulation, procurement, and trade. Weak federal capacity to implement. We're not using the global competitiveness lens that is affecting us so importantly. So there are a series of issues here that really are heading in the same direction of going away from the fragmentation that we've got to something that permits us to collaborate much, much better. Next slide. This particular issue was noted by Peter Nicholson, and in one of his reports in 2017, he said, hey, why don't we build on the sectoral economic strategy tables? They already exist. Those are the 6 there. They're doing an outstanding job. Monique Leroux actually created an industry strategy council on the basis of those tables, and to me came forward with outstanding recommendations in terms of how to support Canadian industry for the benefit of all. So I think we need to consider that. Finally, we have the integrated slide, next slide, which is we need to integrate these things together. And I think it should be by making the economic strategy tables permanent. So we have a net zero industrial strategy for each component of the Canadian economy. You need this. We need to identify, well, what markets are we going to be selling this into and in which countries? We're great at developing trade policy, not so much in terms of trade practice, the practicality of what you need to do to actually get into a supply chain in a foreign country, as opposed to negotiating a general trade agreement. I agree the trade agreements are important, but we need to go further, and we need to retrain the trade commissioners. Where are we going to innovate? I think we've got to keep the shift going in terms of applied research. We've got to go from scaling up to scaling out. And by that, I mean, many countries do collective research. We still do it one-off with the business community. IRAP does it one firm at a time. The SIF program helps one firm at a time. Other countries will do collective pre-commercial research for everybody to take advantage of. So we need to reflect on that. And we need a different skill set. Collaborative governance, diversity management. How do you manage networks? So it's not about managing your own business, your own firm. You're managing an entire complete value chain, which may be 20, 30, 40, 100 different institutions, public, private, academic. And we need to develop the skill sets to be able to do that effectively. So finally, I've got a homework for everybody. And for the federal government, which I think is 50% of the problem, I set out some of the issues you should be looking at, the RDI target and so on. I'm not going to read them all. We'll make them available. Put Humpty Dumpty back together again in terms of the fragmentation that is there. I mean, it's confusing for everybody, for research community, for the business sector, private sector, but 30% of the problem. Got to provide more leadership and management of the tables. You've got to look at focusing on metrics, the input metrics, throughput metrics, output metrics, and really get into the detail of what is going to be needed by sector to be able to improve our performance. And then the higher education sector, about 20% of the problem. Focus on developing talent, looking at the research component as it is serving a public purpose. And I think you've got to look at a projet de pays. Come to the federal government and offer to actually collectively assist in terms of some of the big major challenges it's trying to deal with in the energy transition. And part of that is then repositioning how you're communicating with government. As Alex Usher and others have said, there may be a bit of a challenge there that you got. So next year, we could look at how you're progressing, or if Meridat agrees, we could check on your progress at the CSPC event in November 2023 to see how you've done with your homework assignments. So that's it on behalf of Michael and myself, and back to you, Meridat.
Thank you so very much, David and Michael, for this terrific presentation. That was fascinating. As you can see why we bring David and his team back every year. It's so insightful and excellent analysis with a lot of food for thoughts and a lot of follow-up. We definitely take on the assignments, David, and we'll follow up with you. Global Advantage will pay for this research part and conducted by CSPC. We'll send you the survey and present the reports back at CSPC conference, at the annual Science Policy Conference. We'll chat about this. But before, let's go through some of the questions. David, a couple of comments that I have to read regarding the dental care, because you mentioned on that. There was a comment regarding dental care. Unless you have good insurance through work, you can't afford it. if practitioners have all this money for dental, why isn't it going to the people already? Another comment, dental care is actually important for people's health. It's not just for vanity, but there is also a question about the R&D, the ratio of R&D conducted at higher education institutes versus private institutions. Why do you think this ratio is so skewed in Canada, but not other countries? Dave and Michael, over to you for these.
Well, I think and first of all, the dental care is important. I mean, the point I was making was not that. The issue is that this was not front and center on the current government's agenda, but was, because it's a minority government, to stay in power, it was forced on them. And as you know, the costs have been grossly underestimated in terms of what it is. So what it does, though, is there's an opportunity cost. It means you can't do other investments. And I'm sure there were a whole lack of investments, probably in the research side, that the government was going to go ahead with. But because of the dental package, they've had to forgo them. And so to me, since it's not ahead of federal power, if this were something that a federal government had a responsibility for directly, there might be a different argument. So to me, there's just a bigger issue of asking Canadians to spend $35 billion. I'm not disputing the fact that there may well be extraordinarily well needed, but can we afford it at this time? And can we afford it in relation to the other investments? On the skewing of the education versus private sector, Meredith, we've talked about that. I don't have an answer to that. I mean, it is so pronounced, though, and especially vis-a-vis the U.S., that somebody should take. I mean, SSHRC should do an analysis of this, or SSHRC and NSERC combined, to try and understand what are these distinctions. I think the Bouchard report actually gives us an entry point in terms of doing that. My sense is that the government's not going to give the money in the next budget just because of the Bouchard report, especially when the Bouchard report is saying we need some new structures here and we need a plan. Well, you better have that first of all, and then look at the resources needed to find that. So the opportunity may be now, Meredith, to try and figure out why this imbalance in Canada, what causes it, what's the impact, can any of it be changed, do we want to change it, and so on. So the deeper conversation.
Thank you. I want to read two other questions here. And let me see if I got it right. There you go. One question is regarding the nature of R&D. I'm sorry, these are jumping up and down. So about the ratio of, we asked this question. So the reasons Canada heard the higher education investment appears so high is that only in Canada do institutions count their researchers' salary as a university contribution to HERD. In fact, they should be in the provincial government's total. That was one comment, of course. And so the other question is regarding support for higher education. Is this not something that would also typically fall within the review of the province's territory? So what do you propose could have been considered regarding support for higher education? Dave and Michael, any comment for those?
Yeah, to me, first of all, I want to applaud Paul Davidson, and I sincerely mean this. One of the things over time that I have found is that in terms of budgets, and when I was in finance, I did it as well. Yeah, you give a nominal amount to NSERC, SSHRC, CIHR, et cetera, et cetera. Very often it wasn't enough to cover inflation, and we knew that. And you get positive reactions from the head of these organizations saying, oh, thank you very much, government, and so on. I think we're past that. And people need to be more critical in terms of the gap that we have in this area of activity for Canadians and how important it is. So I applaud Paul Davidson, for saying, we're disappointed. And then actually talking about this in terms of one of his members as being a bupkis budget. I think that's that kind of frank commentary. We're seeing it from John Nubley. We're seeing it, from Peter Nicholson. We're actually seeing it in a variety of reports that the government is coming out saying, hey, we're off track here. We need something new. So the issue then is, well, let's investigate further. let's get the details here that we can all agree upon in terms of understanding the impact. So it's the deeper dive and the deeper conversation that I think needs to be done and then structured, in my view.
Thank you, Dave. I want to read two more questions and then your final comments on these two. The first is, what exactly is meant by R&D in this context? Is pure scientific research included, e.g. reverse physiology, or are we talking about more research with intent to develop marketable technologies? I mean, they refer to applied research in this case. And the other question is, what would collaborative pre-competitive research look like? What is the example how this is done well?
Yeah, Michael, do you want to respond to the first question in terms of that fundamental, the issue of how the Americans structure their research activity and the fact we don't have this data in Canada, for example, Michael?
Yeah, the data does capture the entire chain, from all the way from basic research, kind of blue sky research, through to experimental development, technology development, applications, and implementation. So it covers the entire spectrum. Problematically, and this is one of our assessments of the Canadian systems, is we actually don't measure it along those lines. StatsCan doesn't aggregate. It aggregates our R&D activities along just kind of a general R&D category, whereas other OECD countries break down the basic versus applied versus experimental development components and shows what the activity space is along the continuum, whereas we don't. But it depicts the entirety of it, all the way from research to development.
Meredith, on the second question, in terms of pre-competitive collective research, an example is the German, and it's called the Association of Business Association. It has 50,000 members. It is divided along sectoral and technology lines. It is integrated with their incredible research system, the Fraunhofer and Helmholtz and Max Planck kind of institutes and so on. And it does pre-competitive research. So in terms of technology, you're developing applications, and in some cases, it may be licenses. You don't give it exclusively or sell it exclusively. You make it on a non-exclusive availability, open to any of the members who are participating in that pre-competitive kind of process. Now, the NRC has a couple of initiatives like that they're beginning, which I think are good. We need to have this collective approach, though, to research and then make the benefits available. And those collective approaches can be linked up with, obviously councils and universities and so on. I'm sure in some cases they do exist, but it's to reinforce as opposed to one-offs, helping out one firm at a time. No, let's help out the collectivity in terms of the pre-commercial kind of new knowledge they need to be successful. Yeah.
That was fantastic, Dave. I wish we had another hour to discuss all these. So we have to invite you and Michael back to another session to discuss these in detail. And we're very much looking forward to that, in fact, because I myself have a number of questions which I didn't get the chance to ask, but we take up on your challenge about the survey and we'll follow up, and very much looking forward to funding from Global Advantage on that. So thank you so very much, Dave. And you missed the warm weather of Toronto, 17-degree windy. And I'm not sure if it's better in Mexico, but enjoy the warmer weather perhaps there. We're very much looking forward to see you in Ottawa next week for Research Money Conference. Thank you, Michael. Fantastic presentation. And with that, the first section of our symposium is finished. Dave and Michael, please feel free to stay and answer to questions later on.